The 180-pound mountain lion padded silently through the crowd of 200 mourners, his amber eyes fixed on the wooden casket ahead. Pastor Williams froze mid-prayer, his Bible trembling in weathered hands as gasps rippled through the cemetery. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wild predators don't attend funerals. Women screamed, clutching their children as folding chairs toppled backward. Men reached for cell phones with shaking fingers, some dialing 911, others recording what seemed impossible. The scent of fear mixed with morning dew and funeral lilies. 16-year-old Emma Morrison stood frozen beside her grandfather's casket, remembering Frank's final words, "Tell Spirit, I forgive his mama." The old man had whispered something about secrets, about debts that span generations, about love that transcends death itself. "Nobody move!" shouted Deputy Marcus Thompson, his hand hovering over his service weapon, torn between duty and disbelief. But what brought a wild mountain lion to say goodbye to a retired park ranger? And what secret had Frank Morrison carried to his grave that could explain 18 years of impossible loyalty? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that impossible morning at Riverside Cemetery, Frank Morrison sat on his cabin porch in the golden hour before dawn, watching the mist rise from Lamar Valley. At 78, his hands bore the scars of 45 years protecting Yellowstone's wilderness, rope burns from rescue operations, claw marks from frightened bears, and the faded tattoo of his Navy SEAL unit from a war he'd tried to forget. The mountain air carried the promise of another harsh winter, and Frank's weathered fingers traced the bottle of heart medication he could no longer afford. "Grandpa Frank, you're up early again." Emma Morrison emerged from the cabin, her 16-year-old frame wrapped in one of his old ranger jackets. She'd been living with him for 3 years now, ever since her parents died in that terrible accident on Highway 191. Frank had never told her the truth, that her father wasn't his son, but a young soldier whose life Frank had failed to save in the jungles of Vietnam. The guilt had eaten at him for decades, but raising Emma had given his life meaning again. "Couldn't sleep, sweetheart. Old bones don't rest easy." Frank pocketed the medication, not wanting her to see his struggle. The triple mortgage on the cabin, Hope's medical bills from 15 years ago, and now his own failing heart. The numbers never added up. He'd already decided Emma's college fund was sacred, even if it meant refusing the surgery that could save his life. Down the valley, Dr. Sarah Beth Williams was already setting up her research equipment near the river. The 52-year-old wildlife researcher had arrived from Denver 6 months ago, studying mountain lion behavior patterns with the methodical precision that had defined her career. Recently divorced and estranged from her only daughter, Sarah found solace in data and scientific observation. She scoffed at the local stories about Frank Morrison and his pet mountain lion. Anthropomorphism, she called it, the human tendency to project emotions onto animals incapable of complex feelings. At the Yellowstone Administrative Offices, Deputy Director Marcus Thompson reviewed the morning's incident reports with growing frustration. The 45-year-old administrator had been fighting a private war against the park's predator population ever since that terrible day 10 years ago when a grizzly bear had killed his 8-year-old son, Tommy. Frank Morrison had been off duty that day, drunk with grief over his wife Hope's death. And Marcus had never forgiven him for not being there when families needed protection. Now, mounting pressure from Washington demanded stricter wildlife management protocols, and Marcus saw an opportunity to finally do what should have been done years ago. None of them knew that high in the rocky outcroppings above Frank's cabin, a massive mountain lion named Spirit was already beginning his daily watch. The 18-year-old male carried secrets in his amber eyes, secrets about loyalty, about debt, and about the brain tumor that was slowly changing his behavior in ways that would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between human and wild. The sun crested the mountains, painting Yellowstone in shades of gold and shadow as four lives moved toward a collision that would test the very nature of love, loyalty, and redemption. The October morning started like any other for Frank Morrison, with coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead and a quick check of his heart medication, down to his last week's supply. The prescription cost more than his monthly grocery budget, but Emma didn't need to know that. She was already sacrificing enough, working weekends at the park's gift shop to save for community college instead of pursuing her dreams at Colorado State's veterinary program. Frank loaded his battered Ford pickup with supplies for the injured elk he'd been monitoring near Specimen Ridge. The young bull had taken a bad fall during rutting season, and Frank's daily visits to change the makeshift bandages had become routine. At his age, he should have called the official wildlife team, but budget cuts meant they were stretched thin, and Frank had never been one to wait for bureaucracy when an animal was suffering. The autumn air bit sharp against his face as he hiked the familiar trail, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning light. His chest felt tight, tighter than usual, but he attributed it to the elevation and his advancing years. The elk was grazing peacefully when Frank approached, a good sign that the leg was healing properly. He knelt beside the animal, speaking in the low, soothing tones that had calmed countless frightened creatures over the decades. "Easy there, big fellow. Let's see how you're doing today." The pain hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest, radiating down his left arm with an intensity that dropped him to his knees. The prescription bottle tumbled from his jacket pocket, small white pills scattering across the forest floor as Frank gasped for air. The elk bolted, sensing danger, leaving Frank alone with the crushing weight pressing against his ribs. He fumbled for his radio with trembling fingers, but the device slipped from his grasp, landing just out of reach in the tall grass. His vision blurred as he struggled to stay conscious, thinking of Emma, of all the things he'd never told her, of the secrets he'd carried for far too long. That's when Spirit appeared. The massive mountain lion emerged from the timber like a shadow given form, his tawny coat blending perfectly with the autumn landscape. Most people would have felt terror at the sight of 180 pounds of apex predator, but Frank felt only relief. Spirit approached with careful, deliberate steps, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that Frank had come to recognize over their 18 years together. The big cat positioned himself beside Frank's prone form, his warm bulk providing shelter from the October wind. Spirit's rumbling purr, a sound deeper than any house cat could produce, seemed to vibrate through Frank's chest, somehow easing the crushing pain. The mountain lion's presence was both protection and comfort, a living shield against the wilderness that could be mercilessly unforgiving to the weak or injured. For 6 hours, Spirit maintained his vigil, occasionally standing to pace a tight perimeter before returning to Frank's side. The mountain lion's behavior defied every textbook on predator psychology. Wildcats were supposed to be solitary, opportunistic, and certainly not caregivers to vulnerable humans. Yet here was Spirit, demonstrating a loyalty that would have been remarkable in a trained dog, let alone a creature born to hunt and kill. Dr. Sarah Williams discovered them just after noon, following the GPS coordinates from Frank's last radio check-in. She'd been tracking mountain lion movement patterns in the area when her research assistant reported an overdue ranger. What she found challenged every assumption she'd built her career upon. Through her binoculars, Sarah watched the impossible tableau. Frank Morrison lying unconscious in a meadow while a fully grown mountain lion stood guard over him like a devoted sentinel. Spirit's ears swiveled toward her approach, but the big cat made no move to flee or attack. Instead, he seemed to recognize her as help arriving, stepping back just enough to allow access while maintaining protective proximity. My God, Sarah whispered into her radio, calling for emergency medical evacuation. I need a helicopter at coordinates 44.9537 minus 110.3854. We have a cardiac event, and you're not going to believe this, but we also have a mountain lion providing what I can only describe as first aid. The helicopter's arrival sent Spirit retreating to the tree line, but not far. As paramedics worked to stabilize Frank, the mountain lion watched from 50 yards away, his tail twitching with obvious agitation. Sarah documented everything with her camera, knowing that her colleagues would demand proof of what she was witnessing. At Yellowstone Regional Medical Center, Emma Morrison paced the waiting room with the restless energy of youth confronting mortality. Frank's heart attack had been severe, a widowmaker, the doctor called it, requiring immediate surgery that insurance would only partially cover. The estimated cost made Emma's stomach lurch. $50,000 that might as well have been $50 million. That evening, as Frank lay sedated in the cardiac ICU, Emma discovered the financial records he'd tried to hide. The cabin had been mortgaged 3 times, once for her grandmother Hope's cancer treatment, once to pay for her parents' funeral expenses, and once more to fund the small wildlife sanctuary Frank had quietly established on his property. His pension was garnished to pay medical debts, and his savings account showed a balance of $127. The revelation hit Emma harder than any physical blow. Frank was literally dying rather than burden her with debt, choosing to sacrifice his life for her future opportunities. She found the unsigned will on his desk, leaving everything to her, along with a letter explaining his decision to forego the surgery. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson stood at his office window watching news vans arrive in the parking lot. Someone had leaked Sarah's footage of Spirit guarding Frank, and the story was spreading across social media like wildfire. The hashtag Mountain Lion Hero was trending nationally, but Marcus saw only liability and danger. His phone rang constantly with calls from federal wildlife officials demanding explanations and immediate action. The next morning brought Frank's first conscious moment since the attack, and his first question wasn't about his condition, it was about Spirit. Emma held his hand as he whispered the words that would haunt her. "Tell him I'm sorry about his mama. Tell him I understand now why he stayed." Outside the hospital window, a familiar silhouette watched from the ridge, amber eyes fixed on the building where his human lay fighting for life. Emma Morrison's hands shook as she held her phone, watching the view counter climb past 1 million on the video she'd uploaded 3 days ago. Grandfather and his mountain lion guardian had exploded across social media with a virality that both thrilled and terrified her. The footage she'd secretly recorded over months, Frank sharing his morning coffee routine with Spirit watching from the ridge, the mountain lion following Frank's patrol routes at a respectful distance, their wordless communication that spoke of years of mutual trust, had touched something deep in viewers worldwide. The comments ranged from heartwarming to heartbreaking. "This is what real love looks like," wrote one user. "My grandfather had Alzheimer's and forgot everyone except his old dog," shared another. But it was the private messages that made Emma's breath catch. Offers of help, donations, people sharing their own stories of unexpected animal bonds. A notification popped up. $47,000 raised through the GoFundMe link she'd hastily created. Frank's recovery room had become a shrine of cards, flowers, and gifts from strangers moved by his story. He lay propped against pillows, his weathered face pale but alert, watching Emma with eyes that held too much knowledge. "Sweetheart, we need to talk," he said, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. Emma felt her world tilt as Frank told her the truth she'd sensed but never wanted to confirm. Her father, Private First Class Daniel Hayes, had died in Frank's arms in a Vietnamese jungle 43 years ago. Frank had promised the dying young man that if anything happened, He'd find Daniel's family, take care of them. It had taken Frank 8 years to locate Daniel's widow and infant daughter, Emma's mother, but by then they'd built their own life. Frank watched from a distance, sending anonymous gifts, college scholarships, and help during difficult times. "When your parents died in that crash 3 years ago," Frank continued, his voice breaking, "you had no one else. Child Services was going to place you in foster care. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't fail Daniel again." The tears Emma had been holding back finally came. "You're not my grandfather," she whispered. "Not by blood," Frank admitted. "But Emma, honey, you're the best thing that ever happened to this old man. You gave me a reason to keep living after Hope died. You brought joy back into this house." Before Emma could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent news alert. The headline made her stomach drop. "Dangerous predator terrorizes Yellowstone visitors." The article, published by a tabloid journalist, painted Spirit as a stalking threat, claiming the mountain lion had been conditioning Frank for an eventual attack. It quoted Marcus Thompson extensively, describing Spirit as an unpredictable wild animal that poses an imminent danger to park visitors and staff. Dr. Sarah Williams arrived at the hospital within the hour, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and determination etched on her face. "We need to talk," she told Emma, pulling up a chair beside Frank's bed. Sarah's preliminary research had documented behaviors in Spirit that challenged fundamental assumptions about predator psychology. The mountain lion displayed what could only be described as empathetic responses, protective instincts typically reserved for pack animals, and most remarkably, what appeared to be grief. "3 days ago, I found Spirit at the exact spot where Frank collapsed," Sarah explained, showing them photographs on her laptop. "He'd been returning there every day, lying in the same position, making vocalizations I've never heard from mountain lions. It's as if he's mourning." Frank's eyes filled with understanding and pain. "He's dying, isn't he?" Sarah nodded gravely. The veterinary examination had revealed a brain tumor, likely growing for months. The mass was affecting Spirit's behavior, making him more docile and increasing his attachment to familiar humans. "The strange thing is," Sarah continued, "the tumor should be making him more aggressive, not less. Everything about his behavior contradicts what we know about neurological changes in large cats." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus Thompson's arrival, flanked by 2 federal wildlife officers. Marcus's face was a mask of professional determination, but Emma could see the conflict in his eyes. "Frank, I'm sorry, but we have a situation. Spirit needs to be relocated immediately. The publicity has created a safety liability the park can't ignore." Frank struggled to sit up straighter. "Marcus, you know that cat has never harmed anyone. He's been protecting visitors for years, not threatening them." "The decision's been made," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have 48 hours to tranquilize and relocate him to a wildlife sanctuary in Colorado. It's for everyone's safety, including his own." Emma felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "You can't take him away from Grandpa Frank. They need each other." "Emma," Marcus said gently, using her name for the first time she could remember. "I know this is hard, but wild animals belong in the wild, not attached to humans. It's not natural." Frank's eyes met Marcus's with decades of shared history. "Nothing about love is natural, son, but that doesn't make it wrong." Outside the hospital window, as if summoned by their conversation, Spirit appeared on the distant ridge, a silhouette against the autumn sky, keeping his vigil for the human who had saved his life 18 years ago. The viral video had transformed Frank Morrison's quiet cabin into the epicenter of a media circus that neither he nor Emma had anticipated. News vans lined the gravel road leading to their property, satellite dishes sprouting like mechanical flowers against the backdrop of Yellowstone's ancient mountains. CNN, Fox News, and every major network had dispatched crews to capture what they called the most remarkable human-animal bond ever documented. Frank sat in his wheelchair on the cabin's front porch, still weak from his surgery, but insisting on returning home against his doctor's wishes. The GoFundMe account had swelled to $180,000, enough to cover his medical expenses and Emma's college tuition. But the money felt hollow against the weight of what they were about to lose. In 36 hours, federal wildlife officials would arrive to tranquilize Spirit and transport him to a facility in Colorado, effectively ending an 18-year relationship that had defined both their lives. Emma moved through the cabin like a caged animal, packing boxes with trembling hands while fielding interview requests on her constantly ringing phone. NBC wanted Frank for their morning show. The Discovery Channel offered a documentary deal. Hollywood agents called with movie proposals. But all Emma could think about was the empty ridge where Spirit no longer appeared, the mountain lion having retreated deeper into the wilderness as the media invasion intensified. Dr. Sarah Williams had established a makeshift research station in Frank's living room, her laptops and monitoring equipment covering every available surface. Her preliminary findings were revolutionizing the scientific community's understanding of predator behavior, but the peer review process would take months, too late to save Spirit from relocation. Sarah's own life had become complicated beyond recognition. Her estranged daughter had called after seeing the news coverage, initiating their first conversation in 3 years. "Mom, I saw you on CNN," Jessica had said, her voice small across the phone line. "You looked happy, different. I haven't seen you smile like that since before the divorce." The reconciliation Sarah had dreamed of was finally happening, but the timing felt cruel. Just as she was rebuilding her relationship with Jessica, she was about to lose her connection to Frank and Emma, who had become the family she'd never expected to find in the wilderness. Marcus Thompson spent sleepless nights in his office, staring at federal mandates and public safety protocols while wrestling with memories he'd tried to bury. The media attention had unearthed details about his son Tommy's death that he'd kept private for a decade. Reporters had discovered that Frank wasn't on duty the day Tommy was killed because Marcus's wife had asked him to stay away. Frank had been drinking heavily after Hope's death, and she'd been concerned about his judgment. The truth Marcus had hidden even from himself was that Frank's absence that day wasn't negligence. It was intervention. Frank had been spiraling into alcoholism and depression, and the Thompson family had staged what amounted to an intervention by requesting he take leave. Tommy's death by bear attack was a tragic accident that no ranger could have prevented, but Marcus had needed someone to blame, and Frank's guilt made him an easy target. Now, watching his former best friend fight for his life and his relationship with Spirit, Marcus felt the full weight of his misdirected anger. His wife Sandra had been urging him to seek therapy for years, threatening divorce if he didn't address the rage that had consumed him since Tommy's death. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was being forced to destroy the very relationship that had taught him what unconditional love looked like. The community of Yellowstone employees and local residents was fracturing along unexpected lines. Longtime rangers who had worked with Frank for decades organized a petition demanding Spirit's protection, while newer staff members worried about liability and federal oversight. The nearby town of Gardner saw its tourist economy explode overnight as visitors flocked to catch a glimpse of the famous mountain lion, but local ranchers grew increasingly nervous about predator populations they viewed as already too large. Emma discovered Frank's hidden journal while helping him organize his papers for the media interviews. The leather-bound book contained 40 years of entries chronicling his relationship with Hope, his struggles with Vietnam nightmares, and most surprisingly, detailed observations about Spirit's behavior that read like a wildlife researcher's field notes. Frank had been documenting the mountain lion's intelligence, emotional responses, and protective instincts long before Dr. Williams arrived in Yellowstone. One entry from 6 months earlier made Emma's breath catch. Spirit's behavior is changing. He's allowing closer contact, showing what I can only describe as affection. Sarah would say I'm anthropomorphizing, but I know what I see. He's aging, and I think he knows his time is limited. Animals understand death differently than we do. They don't fear it, but they do prepare for it. I think he's trying to say goodbye. Frank's voice from the porch interrupted her reading. You found the journal. Emma looked up to see him watching her with knowing eyes. Grandpa Frank, you've been studying him this whole time. You knew something was wrong. Frank wheeled himself closer, his movements still careful from the surgery. I've known Spirit was sick for months. The way he started approaching the cabin more often, the changes in his hunting patterns, the increased vocalizations. I've seen enough animals die to recognize the signs. The brain tumor? I suspected something neurological. Wild animals don't typically form attachments like this unless something fundamental has changed in their brain chemistry. Frank's voice carried the weight of decades spent observing wildlife. But, Emma, sweetheart, that tumor might be why he bonded with me. But it's not why he stayed. That's something else entirely. Before Emma could ask what he meant, a commotion outside drew their attention. A convoy of vehicles was approaching, not media this time, but federal wildlife officials arriving a day early for Spirit's capture. The lead vehicle bore the insignia of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, followed by a veterinary transport unit equipped with tranquilizer equipment and a reinforced trailer. Dr. Robert Hancock, the federal wildlife coordinator, emerged from the lead vehicle with the bearing of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. He approached Frank's porch with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. I understand this situation is emotionally challenging, but public safety has to be our primary concern. Frank struggled to his feet, Emma moving quickly to support him. Dr. Hancock, that mountain lion has been protecting this area for 18 years. He's never shown aggression toward humans, never threatened anyone. The only danger here is removing him from his territory. Sir, I've reviewed Dr. Williams's preliminary reports, and while they're fascinating from a research perspective, they don't change the fundamental fact that we're dealing with a large predator exhibiting abnormal behavior. The brain tumor makes him unpredictable, and the media attention has created an untenable situation. Sarah Williams emerged from the cabin, her laptop displaying charts and behavioral data. Dr. Hancock, my research indicates that Spirit's neurological condition has actually made him less aggressive, not more. His protective behaviors toward Mr. Morrison are consistent with pack bonding patterns we see in social predators, not the stalking behaviors of a compromised hunter. Dr. Williams, I respect your work, but we can't base public policy on preliminary findings. The animal needs to be relocated for everyone's safety, including his own. Marcus Thompson arrived at that moment, his patrol vehicle kicking up dust as he parked behind the federal convoy. He approached the group with visible reluctance, his face reflecting the internal battle he'd been fighting for days. Dr. Hancock, I need to formally request a 48-hour delay in this operation. The federal coordinator's eyebrows rose. Deputy Director Thompson, your office specifically requested federal intervention. What's changed? Marcus looked at Frank, decades of shared history passing between them in a single glance. New information has come to light. I need time to review the situation more thoroughly. Emma watched in amazement as the man who had been Spirit's greatest enemy suddenly became an unexpected ally. The teenage pragmatist in her recognized a political maneuver, but the girl who had lost too many family members saw something deeper. Redemption, perhaps, or the first stirrings of healing from a decade-old wound. Dr. Hancock was unmoved. "I'm sorry, but the decision has been made at the federal level. We have authorization to proceed immediately." As if summoned by the conversation, Spirit appeared on the ridge above the cabin. The massive mountain lion stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky, his presence both majestic and heartbreaking. For a moment everyone fell silent, watching the creature whose fate hung in the balance. Emma felt something shift inside her, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This mountain lion represented more than just her grandfather's companion. He was a living symbol of the wild spaces that were disappearing, of the connections between humans and nature that civilization seemed determined to sever. "You can't take him," she said, her young voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn. "Not yet. Not like this." Dr. Hancock's expression softened slightly. "Miss Morrison, I understand your attachment, but—" "No, you don't understand," Emma interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "You see a dangerous animal that needs to be controlled. We see a family member who's been part of our lives longer than I've been alive. You're not just relocating a mountain lion. You're destroying a relationship that proves everything beautiful about the connection between humans and the natural world." Frank's eyes filled with pride as he watched his granddaughter, not by blood but by choice, stand up for the principles he'd spent his life defending. In that moment he saw Hope's fierce spirit, his own stubborn determination, and something entirely new. A young woman who understood that some bonds transcend species, that some love defies explanation, and that some fights are worth having even when victory seems impossible. The standoff continued as Spirit maintained his vigil on the ridge, watching over the humans whose fate had become so intertwined with his own that separating them felt like tearing apart the very fabric of what made life worth living. The tranquilizer dart struck Spirit in the left shoulder as he descended from the ridge, the federal wildlife team having tracked him through the forest for 3 hours using radio telemetry and thermal imaging. Frank Morrison watched through his cabin window as the massive mountain lion stumbled, his powerful legs betraying him as the sedative coursed through his bloodstream. The sight of Spirit collapsing among the aspen trees, his amber eyes confused and frightened, sent Frank into a rage that his weakened heart couldn't sustain. "No!" Frank roared, struggling to rise from his wheelchair as another crushing pain seized his chest. The monitor Emma had insisted he wear began beeping frantically as his heart rhythm became erratic. "You bastards! He trusted you. He came down because he trusted you." Emma rushed to Frank's side as he clutched his chest, his face gray with pain and fury. This second heart attack was different, more severe, more frightening in its intensity. As she dialed 911 with shaking fingers, Emma watched through the window as federal agents loaded Spirit's unconscious form into a reinforced transport trailer. The mountain lion who had protected her grandfather for 18 years was being taken away just as Frank fought for his life once again. Dr. Sarah Williams burst through the cabin door, her face flushed from running. She'd been documenting Spirit's capture when Frank's medical monitor triggered an emergency alert on her equipment. "The ambulance is 5 minutes out," she told Emma, kneeling beside Frank's wheelchair and checking his pulse. "Frank, stay with us. Don't you dare give up now." But Frank's eyes were fixed on the transport trailer, pulling away from his property, carrying the closest thing to family he'd known since Hope's death. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The journal. Back page. Tell Spirit." His words dissolved into labored breathing as the paramedics arrived, their efficient movements filling the cabin with urgent medical terminology and the harsh electronic sounds of life support equipment. As they loaded Frank onto a stretcher, Emma clutched his journal to her chest. watching the man who had saved her life slip away for the second time in 2 weeks. Marcus Thompson stood in the hospital corridor, his hands trembling as he held his resignation letter. He'd written it during the long hours of Frank's surgery, finally acknowledging that his decade of misdirected anger had nearly cost him the friendship that had once defined his youth. The federal operation had proceeded exactly as he'd requested, but watching Frank collapse as Spirit was taken away had shattered the last of Marcus's certainty about his choices. Sandra Thompson found him there at 3 a.m, their newborn son sleeping in her arms. "The doctor says Frank is stable," she said softly, settling beside her husband on the uncomfortable waiting room chairs. "He's going to survive this one, too." Marcus looked at his infant son, seeing in the child's peaceful face all the hopes and fears that had driven him to such destructive decisions. "I killed our friendship over Tommy's death," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I blamed Frank for not being there. But the truth is, I sent him away because I was afraid he'd get someone else killed. I was protecting him, and when Tommy died anyway, I couldn't live with the guilt. It was easier to hate Frank than to accept that sometimes terrible things just happen." "Marcus," Sandra said gently, "Tommy's death wasn't your fault, and it wasn't Frank's fault. It was a terrible accident. But what you did to Spirit today, that was a choice. And it's not too late to make a different choice." Dr. Sarah Williams spent the night in Frank's hospital room, her laptop open as she compiled the most comprehensive report on human-animal bonding ever documented. Her research had evolved beyond mere behavioral observation into something approaching proof that consciousness and emotional complexity existed far beyond human experience. Spirit's capture had provided the final piece of data she needed. The mountain lion's stress responses during separation from Frank matched patterns typically seen in human attachment disorders. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Jessica. "Mom, I saw the news about Spirit being taken away. Dad told me you've been studying them for months. Can you save him?" The question pierced Sarah's heart because she knew the answer. Her preliminary research, no matter how groundbreaking, would take months to pass through peer review and federal bureaucracy. Spirit would be in captivity long before her findings could influence policy. The mountain lion's brain tumor meant he might not survive the stress of relocation and confinement. Emma found the message Frank had referenced on the journal's final page, written in his careful handwriting. "If something happens to me, tell Spirit that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing love over fear every single day." His mother did what mothers do. She protected her territory and her young. "I understand now that the night Hope died, that mountain lion wasn't attacking my wife. She was protecting her from whatever scared her enough to run into predator territory in the middle of the night. Spirit's mother stayed with Hope until I found them both. Some debts can only be repaid through generations of love." The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Spirit wasn't just any mountain lion. He was the son of the cat that had been with Hope during her final moments 18 years ago. Frank's bond with Spirit had been born from gratitude, maintained through guilt, and deepened by a love that transcended species barriers. The mountain lion hadn't killed Frank's wife. He'd inherited the responsibility of protecting the family she'd left behind. At the Colorado Wildlife Sanctuary, 400 miles south of Yellowstone, Spirit lay in a veterinary examination room as Dr. Patricia Vance reviewed his medical scans. The brain tumor was larger than the preliminary reports had indicated, pressing against areas of the brain responsible for spatial recognition and social bonding. The mountain lion's attachment to Frank Morrison wasn't just behavioral conditioning, it was neurological necessity. Without the familiar landmarks and relationships that anchored his damaged spatial processing, Spirit was experiencing what could only be described as severe psychological distress. "He's not eating," Dr. Vance told Dr. Hancock over the phone. His stress levels are off the charts and he's showing signs of severe depression. Mountain lions typically adapt to captivity within 48 hours, but this animal seems to be shutting down entirely. Dr. Hancock rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of a decision that had seemed straightforward 2 days ago. What's your professional recommendation? Honestly, this animal needs to return to his familiar territory and social bonds, or we're going to lose him. The neurological damage means he can't adapt to new environments the way a healthy mountain lion would. We're essentially torturing him by keeping him here. Back in Yellowstone, news of Spirit's condition spread through social media with the same viral intensity that had made Frank and Spirit's story famous. The hashtag #BringSpiritHome began trending globally as animal lovers, conservationists, and ordinary people who had been moved by their story demanded the mountain lion's return. Celebrities shared the posts, wildlife organizations issued statements of support, and politicians began feeling pressure to intervene. Emma sat beside Frank's hospital bed as he drifted in and out of consciousness, his recovery complicated by the emotional trauma of Spirit's removal. The doctors had stabilized his heart condition, but his spirit seemed as broken as Spirit's own. "Grandpa Frank," she whispered, "I know you can hear me. Spirit needs you to fight. We all need you to fight." Frank's eyes opened, focusing on Emma with effort. "How is he?" "Not good," Emma admitted, her honesty born from respect for Frank's intelligence. "He's not adapting to captivity. The vets think the brain tumor makes it impossible for him to adjust to new environments." Frank struggled to sit up, determination overriding his physical weakness. "Then we have to bring him home. The federal government isn't going to just reverse their decision because—" "Emma," Frank interrupted, his voice gaining strength, "I've spent 45 years learning how bureaucracy works. Sometimes you have to go around it, not through it." Dr. Sarah Williams entered the room at that moment, her face bearing news that would change everything. "Frank, I just got off the phone with the National Geographic Society. They want to fund a comprehensive study of Spirit's unique neurological condition. More importantly, they're willing to designate your property as an official research sanctuary, which would give Spirit federal protection as a research subject rather than a relocated predator." Marcus Thompson appeared in the doorway, his resignation letter tucked in his jacket pocket. "Frank, I need to tell you something. About the day Tommy died. About why you weren't there. About everything I've done wrong for the past 10 years. As Frank listened to Marcus's confession, Emma watched decades of pain and misunderstanding begin to dissolve between the two old friends. The teenage girl who had learned about forgiveness from watching a mountain lion's loyalty understood that healing sometimes required the courage to admit when love had been disguised as anger. Outside the hospital window, the empty ridge where Spirit should have been keeping his vigil served as a reminder that some bonds, once broken, leave scars that never fully heal. But in the hospital room, where 3 generations of chosen family gathered around Frank's bedside, the possibility of redemption flickered like a candle in the darkness, waiting to be rekindled by the simple act of bringing home those we love. The fight for Spirit's return was about to begin, and this time they wouldn't be fighting alone. The call came at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would shatter what remained of Frank Morrison's world. "Doctor." Patricia Vance's voice carried the weight of failure as she delivered news that no amount of preparation could soften. Spirit had died during the night, his heart giving out under the relentless stress of captivity and neurological deterioration. "He stopped eating completely 3 days ago," Dr. Vance explained to the gathered family in Frank's hospital room. "The brain tumor had progressed to the point where basic survival instincts were compromised. Without the familiar environmental cues of his territory, his damaged spatial processing couldn't adapt. In essence, he died of a broken heart compounded by neurological failure. Frank's face went ashen as the words hit him like physical blows. The mountain lion who had been his companion, protector, and connection to the wild for 18 years was gone, not from old age or natural causes, but from the trauma of forced separation. The guilt that had driven Frank to protect wildlife for 4 decades now focused into a laser of self-blame that threatened to stop his healing heart permanently. Emma watched her grandfather's spirit crumble in real time. The man who had survived Vietnam, his wife's death, financial ruin, and 2 heart attacks was being destroyed by the loss of a relationship that most people couldn't even understand. "It's my fault," Frank whispered, his voice hollow. "I should have fought harder. I should have found a way to stop them." "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Vance continued gently, "there's something else you need to know. During the necropsy, we found something unusual. Spirit had been microchipped as a cub, a rehabilitation tag from 18 years ago. According to the records, you were listed as his official guardian through the Wildlife Rehabilitation Program. Legally, Spirit was never actually wild. He was your responsibility under federal conservation protocols." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Marcus Thompson, who had orchestrated Spirit's removal, felt the foundation of his justification crumble. The mountain lion he'd treated as a dangerous wild predator had actually been Frank's legal ward, protected under the same federal regulations Marcus had used to authorize his capture. "That means," Sarah Williams said slowly, her scientific mind processing the implications, "that removing Spirit from Frank's care was essentially kidnapping a protected research animal. The Federal Wildlife Service had no legal authority to relocate him." Marcus sank into a chair, the weight of his actions crushing him. His vendetta against Frank had led him to authorize the illegal seizure of a federally protected animal, resulting in its death. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect the public from what he perceived as a dangerous predator, he had violated the very laws designed to protect endangered wildlife. Emma's phone began buzzing with notifications as news of Spirit's death spread across social media. The same viral networks that had made their story famous now carried a different message: outrage, grief, and demands for accountability. Justice. For Spirit began trending globally as millions of people who had been moved by the story of interspecies love now channeled their emotion into fury at the bureaucratic failures that had caused Spirit's death. Dr. Sarah Williams felt her career hanging in the balance as she prepared to testify at the emergency federal hearing convened to investigate Spirit's death. Her research, which had been dismissed as preliminary and unscientific just days earlier, was now being scrutinized as potential evidence of federal misconduct. The data she'd collected on Spirit's neurological condition and his attachment to Frank could prove that officials had ignored clear scientific evidence when authorizing his removal. "Sarah," her daughter Jessica said during their phone call that evening, "I've been reading about your research online. The scientific community is rallying behind you. Harvard, Stanford, National Geographic. They're all demanding a formal investigation into why your findings were ignored." But professional vindication felt hollow against the reality of Spirit's death. Sarah had spent her career studying animal behavior, but she'd never fully understood the emotional cost of that research until she watched Frank's grief consume him. The mountain lion's death had taught her something that no amount of academic study could provide: that the connections between humans and animals weren't just subjects for research, they were sacred bonds that deserved protection. Frank's condition deteriorated rapidly as grief compounded his physical recovery. The cardiac monitor showed increasing irregularities as his will to live seemed to ebb with each passing hour. Emma rarely left his bedside, reading him the thousands of messages of support that poured in from around the world, but nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of despair that had settled around him. "Grandpa Frank," Emma whispered during one of his conscious moments, "Spirit wouldn't want you to give up. He spent 18 years protecting you. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing." Frank's eyes focused on Emma with effort. "He died thinking I abandoned him. Died alone and scared in a place that smelled like disinfectant instead of pine trees and mountain air." "How do I live with that, sweetheart?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Thompson entered the hospital room carrying a manila folder that contained his complete confession and resignation. But more importantly, he carried news that would either save Frank's spirit or destroy what remained of it. "Frank," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "there's something else about Spirit's death you need to know. The veterinary team said he wasn't alone at the end. Dr. Vance spent the entire night with him, talking to him, telling him about you and Emma and his home in Yellowstone. She said his last moments weren't filled with fear. They were filled with memories of the mountains and the human who had loved him enough to save his life as a cub." Marcus placed a small wooden box on Frank's bedside table. "They found this in Spirit's enclosure the morning he died. Somehow he'd managed to carry it from Yellowstone." Emma opened the box with trembling fingers to reveal a smooth river stone worn by years of handling. It was one of the stones Frank had collected during his walks with Spirit, part of a ritual they'd shared where Frank would pocket interesting rocks and Spirit would investigate them with the curiosity of a giant cat. The mountain lion had somehow carried this token of their shared life across 400 miles, preserving it through capture, transport, and captivity. Frank's tears came then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his weakened frame, but somehow seemed to release the poison of guilt that had been killing him. He held the stone against his chest, feeling in its familiar weight the 18 years of loyalty, protection, and love that Spirit had given him. "He didn't die thinking I abandoned him," Frank realized, his voice breaking with emotion. "He died knowing I loved him. He carried a piece of home with him to the end." The stone became a bridge between grief and healing, between the devastating loss of Spirit and the possibility that their story might mean something larger than one man's relationship with one mountain lion. In holding that simple piece of granite, Frank understood that Spirit's death, tragic as it was, had exposed something important about the connections between humans and the natural world. Connections that deserve protection, respect, and recognition under law. As news of the river stone spread through social media, Spirit's story transformed from tragedy into catalyst for change, inspiring federal legislation to protect human-animal bonds and prevent future bureaucratic failures that could destroy relationships like theirs. 2 weeks after Spirit's death, as Frank Morrison sat in his wheelchair staring at the empty ridge where his companion had once kept vigil, a knock at the cabin door brought news that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his 18-year relationship with the mountain lion. Emma answered, to find a woman in her early 50s, her weathered face bearing the unmistakable marks of someone who had spent years working outdoors. "Mr. Morrison?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "My name is Dr. Linda Hayes. I was the veterinary researcher who microchipped Spirit as a cub 18 years ago. I need to tell you something about that mountain lion that's going to be very difficult to hear." Frank wheeled himself to the door, Emma helping him navigate the threshold. Dr. Hayes carried a thick manila folder and wore the expression of someone bearing a burden that had grown too heavy to carry alone. She accepted their invitation to sit at the kitchen table, placing the folder between them like evidence in a trial. "Mr. Morrison, you need to understand that Spirit wasn't just any mountain lion cub when you found him injured in that snare. He was part of a research project I was conducting on maternal behavior in large predators. His mother was a tagged female I'd been studying for 3 years, a cat we designated as F-47, but I called her Hope. Frank's blood ran cold. Hope was my wife's name. I know, Dr. Hayes said softly. That's why this is so difficult. The night your wife died, she was found near F-47's den site. The official report said she'd gotten lost during a hiking expedition and suffered a fatal heart attack. But there was always something that didn't make sense about the location where her body was discovered. Emma felt the room spinning as Dr. Hayes opened the folder and spread out photographs, research notes, and tracking data from 18 years ago. The documents painted a picture that challenged everything Frank had believed about his wife's death and his relationship with Spirit. Your wife wasn't lost, Mr. Morrison. She was dying. The cancer had metastasized to her brain, causing confusion and disorientation. According to the timeline I've reconstructed, she left your cabin during the night and wandered into the forest. F-47 found her collapsed near the den where her 6-month-old cub, Spirit, was sheltering. Frank's hands trembled as he reached for one of the photographs showing his wife's final resting place. The image revealed something no official report had mentioned. Clear evidence that the mountain lion had attempted to provide shelter and warmth to the dying woman. Mountain lions don't typically show protective behavior toward humans, Dr. Hayes continued, her voice thick with emotion. But F-47 had lost her mate earlier that season and was exhibiting signs of severe stress. When she found your wife, something extraordinary happened. She recognized a fellow mother in distress and responded with the same protective instincts she would have shown to her own kind. The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. His wife hadn't died alone in the wilderness. She'd been comforted in her final moments by a creature that had recognized her pain and chosen compassion over instinct. The mountain lion he'd spent years believing had somehow caused Hope's death had actually been her guardian angel. There's more, Dr. Hayes said gently. 3 days after your wife's death, poachers set the snare that injured Spirit. When you found him and brought him to the ranger station, I was the veterinarian who treated his wounds. I knew who he was, F-47's cub, but I couldn't tell you because the research was classified under federal wildlife protection protocols. Emma watched her grandfather process information that was rewriting the fundamental narrative of his life. The guilt that had driven him to protect wildlife for 4 decades, the sense of debt he'd felt toward Spirit, the complex emotions surrounding his wife's death, all of it was based on a misunderstanding that had shaped 18 years of devotion. So, when I saved Spirit, Frank said slowly, I was actually repaying a debt I didn't know I owed. His mother protected Hope in her final moments, and I protected him in return, without ever realizing the connection. That's exactly right, Dr. Hayes confirmed. And there's something else you need to know. Spirit's unusual attachment to you wasn't just gratitude for saving his life. Based on my research into mountain lion cognitive development, he likely inherited cellular memories from his mother, scent recognition, territorial markers, even emotional imprints. In a very real sense, Spirit grew up knowing that your family was under his protection because his mother had made that choice. Doctor. Sarah Williams, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with her laptop open to brain scan images. This explains Spirit's neurological patterns. The tumor wasn't just affecting his spatial processing, it was enhancing memory consolidation in areas of the brain associated with social bonding. His attachment to Frank wasn't pathological, it was an amplified version of inherited protective instincts. The scientific validation of Spirit's behavior felt both vindicating and heartbreaking. Frank had lost his companion just as they were beginning to understand the depth and complexity of their relationship. The mountain lion who had died in captivity hadn't been a wild animal forming an impossible bond with a human. He'd been fulfilling a genetic legacy of protection that stretched back to his mother's final act of compassion. Marcus Thompson arrived as Dr. Hayes was sharing the final pieces of her research. His resignation from the Park Service had been officially accepted, but he'd spent the weeks since Spirit's death investigating the bureaucratic failures that had led to the tragedy. What he'd discovered was a pattern of scientific evidence being ignored in favor of risk-averse policies that prioritized liability over animal welfare. "Frank," Marcus said, placing a legal document on the table, "the federal investigation has concluded that Spirit's removal violated multiple wildlife protection statutes. The government is prepared to offer a substantial settlement, but more importantly, they're implementing new protocols to prevent similar incidents." The offer of financial compensation felt hollow against the magnitude of their loss, but the policy changes represented something more significant: recognition that the bonds between humans and animals deserved legal protection and scientific respect. Emma picked up the small river stone Spirit had carried to his death, feeling its smooth weight in her palm. "Dr. Hayes, you said Spirit inherited memories from his mother. Do you think he knew about what his mother did for Grandma Hope?" Dr. Hayes considered the question carefully. "I believe he did, on some level. Mountain lions have sophisticated scent memory and territorial recognition. Spirit would have known that your grandmother had been in his mother's territory, that she'd been accepted and protected. In caring for Frank, he was continuing his mother's work." The revelation transformed their grief into something more complex, a mixture of sadness for Spirit's death and wonder at the intergenerational legacy of compassion that had connected their families across species lines. Frank's decades of wildlife protection work hadn't been penance for an imagined failure. It had been part of a larger cycle of care and protection that began with a dying mountain lion's choice to comfort a lost human woman. As evening settled over Yellowstone, Frank sat on his porch holding the river stone while Emma read aloud from the thousands of messages that continued to pour in from around the world. Spirit's story had touched something universal: the human need to believe that love and loyalty could transcend the boundaries between species, that compassion could be passed down through generations, and that death could not break the bonds formed by genuine care. "Grandpa Frank," Emma said, closing her laptop and settling beside his wheelchair, "I've been thinking about what happens next. The settlement money, the media attention, the research foundation, Dr. Williams wants to establish. It's all wonderful, but what do you want to do?" Frank looked up at the ridge where Spirit would never again maintain his vigil, then at the young woman who had become his greatest treasure. "I want to make sure Spirit's mother's legacy lives on. She chose compassion over fear, protection over predation. That's the story we need to tell the world." The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything once again, setting in motion events that would honor Spirit's memory in ways none of them could have imagined. The caller's identity and message would prove that some stories are too powerful to end with death, and that love, once established, finds ways to perpetuate itself across time, distance, and even the barriers between life and death. As Frank reached for the phone, Emma noticed movement on the distant ridge, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, familiar yet impossible. The conversation that followed would reveal that Spirit's story was far from over, and that the mountain lion's greatest gift to the Morrison family was yet to be discovered. The phone call that morning came from Dr. Patricia Vance at the Colorado Wildlife Sanctuary, her voice carrying an excitement that seemed impossible given the tragic circumstances of their last conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to sit down for this. We've made a discovery about Spirit that changes everything we thought we knew about his death." Frank gripped the phone tighter, Emma moving closer to listen as Dr. Vance continued. During the final necropsy examination, we found something extraordinary. Spirit had been caring for something in his enclosure that we initially missed, a small den he'd created in the corner where he'd been hiding a newborn mountain lion cub. The words hit Frank like lightning. A cub? How is that possible? We believe Spirit encountered a pregnant female during his final days in Yellowstone and somehow took responsibility for her offspring after she died giving birth. The timing suggests this happened just before his capture, Mr. Morrison. This cub is approximately 3 weeks old, and genetically she's Spirit's daughter. Emma's eyes filled with tears as the implications washed over her. Spirit hadn't just died in captivity. He'd died protecting his child, using his final days to ensure her survival, just as his own mother had protected Frank's wife 18 years earlier. The cycle of protection and care that had defined their relationship was continuing into a new generation. "Is she healthy?" Frank asked, his voice trembling with emotion and hope. "She's perfect," Dr. Vance replied. "Strong, alert, and showing the same unusual social behaviors we documented in Spirit. But here's the remarkable part. She responds to recordings of your voice. We've been playing the audio from Emma's viral videos to calm her, and she exhibits clear recognition and comfort responses. The revelation that Spirit's daughter somehow knew Frank's voice suggested something beyond scientific explanation, a genetic memory or learned behavior that connected her to the human who had been her father's closest companion. Dr. Sarah Williams, who had been monitoring the conversation, immediately began formulating research proposals to study this unprecedented case of inherited social bonding. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Vance continued, "there's a legal precedent for returning Spirit's offspring to your care. Since Spirit was officially your ward under federal protection, his dependent cubs would fall under the same guardianship. If you're willing to accept the responsibility, we can transfer custody of the cub to your sanctuary." Frank looked at Emma, seeing in her young face the same wonder and determination that had driven him to save Spirit nearly 2 decades earlier. The opportunity to care for Spirit's daughter felt like receiving an unexpected gift from beyond death, a chance to honor his companion's memory while continuing the legacy of protection that had defined their relationship. "What would we call her?" Emma asked, already imagining the tiny mountain lion who carried Spirit's bloodline, and perhaps his capacity for extraordinary human connection. "Hope," Frank said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." The decision to bring Spirit's daughter home triggered a media frenzy that eclipsed even the original viral video. News outlets worldwide covered the story of the mountain lion cub who represented hope, redemption, and the continuation of an impossible bond between species. The hashtag #HopeComesHome trended globally as millions of people followed the legal proceedings that would determine the cub's fate. Marcus Thompson, despite his resignation from the Park Service, used his remaining influence to expedite the custody transfer process. His efforts to bring Hope to Yellowstone became a form of penance for his role in Spirit's death, a way to honor the friendship with Frank that he'd nearly destroyed through years of misdirected anger. "Frank," Marcus said during one of his daily visits to the cabin, "Sandra and I have been talking. We want to establish a trust fund for Hope's care and the wildlife sanctuary you're planning. It's the least we can do after everything that happened." The Thompsons' financial support, combined with the ongoing donations from Spirit's worldwide fan base, made it possible to transform Frank's modest property into a properly equipped wildlife rehabilitation facility. The sanctuary would specialize in caring for orphaned mountain lion cubs, providing them with the socialization and protection they needed before returning them to the wild. Dr. Sarah Williams accepted the position of chief researcher for the Morrison Wildlife Sanctuary, bringing her daughter Jessica to Yellowstone as her research assistant. The reunion between mother and daughter, catalyzed by their shared grief over Spirit's death, had blossomed into a partnership that combined Sarah's scientific expertise with Jessica's background in digital media and public outreach. "Mom," Jessica said as they prepared the sanctuary's research protocols, "this story isn't just about animal behavior anymore. It's about healing, for humans and animals both. People see themselves in Frank's relationship with Spirit, and now with Hope." The week before Hope's arrival, Frank experienced his strongest day since the heart attacks. Emma helped him walk the perimeter of their property, planning the enclosures and facilities that would house Hope and future rescued cubs. The physical activity and sense of purpose seemed to energize Frank in ways that medical treatment alone couldn't achieve. "Grandpa Frank," Emma said as they paused at the ridge where Spirit used to keep watch, "are you ready for this? Raising a mountain lion cub is going to be completely different from caring for an adult cat who already knew how to survive in the wild." Frank smiled, feeling more hopeful than he had since Spirit's death. "Sweetheart, I've learned that the most important things in life aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones that choose you, just like Spirit chose me, and just like you chose to stay with an old man who couldn't tell you the truth about your family." The morning Hope arrived at Yellowstone, transported in a specially designed carrier that allowed her to see and smell her new environment. Frank experienced something he'd thought was lost forever, the profound joy of welcoming a new family member. The 3-month-old cub was larger than he'd expected, with Spirit's distinctive facial markings and the same amber eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. When the carrier door opened in the sanctuary's main enclosure, Hope emerged cautiously, her small head swiveling as she took in the sights and sounds of her father's homeland. Frank sat in his wheelchair just outside the enclosure, speaking in the same gentle tones he'd used with Spirit for 18 years. "Hello, little Hope," he said softly. "Welcome home, sweetheart. Your daddy would be so proud of you." Hope's ears perked at Frank's voice, and she moved toward the fence with confident steps that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. When she reached the barrier separating them, she pressed her small body against the mesh, making soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably similar to Spirit's distinctive purring. Emma filmed the encounter with trembling hands, knowing she was documenting the beginning of a relationship that would help heal the wounds left by Spirit's tragic death. The video she uploaded that evening, showing Hope's immediate connection to Frank, garnered over 10 million views in its first 24 hours, proving that the world was hungry for stories of love triumphing over loss. As the sun set over Yellowstone that first day, Frank sat beside Hope's enclosure, reading aloud from the journal he'd kept during Spirit's life. The young mountain lion seemed to listen with the same attentive intelligence her father had shown, occasionally making soft sounds that suggested understanding. "Your daddy saved my life in more ways than I can count," Frank told Hope as stars began appearing in the vast Montana sky. "Now it's my turn to save yours, and maybe together we can save a few more along the way." The cycle of protection, care, and love that had defined Frank's relationship with Spirit was beginning anew, carrying with it the promise that some bonds truly do transcend death, and that hope, once lost, can return in the most unexpected and miraculous forms. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't between two people. They're between souls who choose each other across impossible odds. Frank Morrison's journey with Spirit, and now Hope, reminds us that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the unwavering commitment to show up for each other day after day, year after year. When Frank thought he'd lost everything that mattered, when his heart literally couldn't bear another goodbye, Hope appeared as living proof that love finds a way to continue. The river stone spirit carried to his death, the inherited protective instincts passed from mother to son to daughter, The sanctuary built from grief transformed into purpose. These aren't just beautiful coincidences. They're evidence that our deepest connections create ripples that extend far beyond our own lifetime. Frank discovered that the secret to healing isn't forgetting our losses, but finding ways to honor them through new acts of love. In caring for Hope, he's not replacing Spirit. He's continuing their story. Every morning when Hope greets Frank with that familiar purr, every moment she demonstrates her father's gentle wisdom, we're reminded that the bonds we forge with pure intention become the foundation for all the love that follows. What moment in your life taught you that love can transcend loss? Have you ever experienced an unexpected second chance that felt like a gift from someone you'd lost? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.